Thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Geraint Edwards. I'm at a company called GWE Systems Limited, and the main thing I'm responsible for is I'm the lead developer of JEvents, the online calendar for Joomla. I've done a lot of bespoke component development over the years, and what I do a lot of is taking something that's there already and copying it, renaming it, and basically working from there. So hopefully what we can do today is show you all something of a skeleton of a component that, you know, if you're developing components in the future, you might be able to use something like this, and it's like a glorified hello world that will teach you some of the foundations, and then you'll have something to work from. So, ideally you'd have a little bit of PHP experience, even if that's just cutting and pasting inside a template override. So have people got some PHP experience, some coding experience in other languages? Right, again. You know, even if you've just got HTML and CSS, you know, you should be able to get something from this session so that you can then go back, look at the code samples, and hopefully the words in the presentation, and then it might make a bit more sense at a second visit. We're going to go over a lot of stuff, so don't worry if you start losing it by the end, just try and keep awake. I'll do my best to keep it entertaining. Has anybody here developed a plugin, a module, a component, anything for Joomla? Yep. So hopefully learn more, right, yeah. So interestingly, if you're interested, for the people who have actually developed components before, the reason I did this presentation was I wrote it initially for Joomla 1.7, and I'd written lots of stuff for 1.0, 1.5, and I'd never done anything that was really using the Joomla framework and the MVC in the strict way that it was supposed to be done. So for me, writing this presentation was a way of forcing myself to learn that as well. So even if you've developed this stuff before, hopefully you might learn something from that as well. The idea is to explain the main concepts, and basically I'll be dipping in and out of the code a lot. So that's the reason I'm sitting down here at the laptop as opposed to standing up with a zapper, because I need to show you the code, and you can't do that when you're using a remote control. So the goal is we'll have a functioning component by the end of the session. We'll have something that works by the end of the first session, and then if anybody turns up for the second session, we'll have something even more advanced by the end of the second session. So first of all, what is our component? These are what I'm going to be covering. So what is our component? The development environment that I'm going to be using. There's a couple of chairs up here as well. There's one there, one in the front over there. The idea is that you follow along. So I'm going to show you some of the code. If you've downloaded the files, you'll be able to install them and run them on your server as we run along. So if you have problems with it, let me know as we're going along. We're going to go through the data structure, the back-end interaction with the component. From getting the back-end working, the basics there, we'll then get into the front-end interaction and then maybe discuss what you might want to do to make this application slightly more sexy. So, what is our component? The idea is to build a recipe management component. So this is completely artificial, but I don't think there actually is a recipe management component out there, so maybe it's something that should be developed further. Might there? Okay, so the idea is, you know, families, people who cook at home, chefs or whatever, can create their recipes online, and users can come along, search for recipes based on ingredients, on categories, on titles. They could then maybe, you know, you can add lots of social media stuff in at a later date with plugins and things, but, you know, we're not going to get anywhere near that level of sophistication. What we are going to be able to do is have the ability for people to create recipes, categorize them, sort them, search them, and so forth. We're going to talk about embedding images in these, how you might add custom fields and so forth. So the basics will be working. It's not going to be a finished commercial product. I wouldn't put it on extensions.joomla.org just yet, but, you know, it's something that might get there one day. The development environment I'm going to be using is NetBeans. I think somebody was talking about PHP Storm earlier on. Do people use IDEs at all? What do people?
PHP Storm.
PHP Storm, yeah. Well, you'll... Say again, sorry? Notepad++, yeah. Well, that's fine, it's fine. I'll show you some of the benefits of NetBeans. Because I wasn't at the PHP Storm, I couldn't argue with Thomas. It's a very powerful PHP development environment. It's lightweight, fairly easy to use. It's open source, no cost, and it runs on Unix, Mac, and Windows. So it's multi-platform. Using Xdebug allows debugging of PHP code, which I think is essential if you're going to be debugging and developing a component. You don't want to be using echoing little bits of report error messages into the output page just to work out where you are and what's going on. And there's a plugin for browsers called Xdebug, Easy Xdebug for Firefox and Chrome, which makes it very easy to debug live web pages. When I developed this, I used Subversion for it and basically built different versions of the application, created branches and tags, and basically locked down version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5. Basically, are people familiar with version control software like Subversion or Git? Do you know what it is, what it does?
Basically, I know what it is, but I never got it really.
Right.
I gave up and just...
Yeah, but even if you're just developing for yourself, by yourself, something like Subversion is very helpful because it allows you to experiment with code, and if something goes wrong, you can go back to what you had before. You can say, right, this is a good point we've reached. It's looking pretty good. I want to keep hold of that, and you can basically commit that, and you then can go back to that version of the code at a later date. So it's a very useful thing to do. And what I always do is, with Subversion, I check out 2 different bits of a component. So you can see here I'm checking out the administrator components com recipes is checked out from, say, the admin subfolder of the repository. Yep.
Why are you doing that?
Why do I do that?
Don't mind that I interrupt you. Why are you doing that?
Why am I doing that, or why do I use Subversion?
Why do you, not Subversion, checking out 2 different parts of the component?
Right, because I have one repository for the whole component. So the recipes thing is in one repository in Subversion. And if I check out the admin side into the admin side of Joomla and the site side into the site side of Joomla, the files are coming from the original same place in Subversion, so it's all held together. But in Joomla, they need to be in 2 separate places. So the advantage of having them come from 2 different places in Subversion into Joomla is that when you're doing the debugging, you can basically step through the code where the code is actually meant to be. Does that make any sense?
That makes sense. It's just new to me.
Yeah.
I'm using build scripts.
Right.
I have a checked out version of my repository,
Yeah.
and then whatever changes I make, I basically then copy them via build script.
Oh, right. Well, you don't need to do any of that with this. If you do it this way, you don't need a build script at all. You basically, as I say here, you just export from Subversion. In this case, I move the manifest file and then zip up the files. And it takes approximately 12 seconds to create an installable.
Scripts, it takes seconds also, that's not a speed issue.
Yes. Well, this is just the way I do it. Yeah. Yeah, everybody has different ways of doing it. This is the way I found works easily. So as I said just before, I don't know if anybody wasn't here at the time when you came in, you can download the installables. If people want to know at the end of the presentation, both the presentation and the download files are available online off the JEvents website, so you can look at the presentation again and download the components and actually install them on your own server. So if you've got laptops, fire them up, get your development server running, and I'll tell you when you need to install which versions at the appropriate time. So what we're going to have is 5 different versions. Version 001 is going to basically be Hello World. It's going to just output Hello World in the front end and the back end. It's going to give you a little bit of stuff about category permissions, but not much more than that. It's just a very bare bone skeleton. Then we're going to start laying the foundations for the recipe management, so basically some of the data structures and so forth. then we'll get basically managing recipes in the back end. So by the time we get to version 3, we'll be doing categories, creating recipes in the back end, be able to filter the lists, pagination, and all that sort of stuff. And the good thing about all of this, as you'll see, is that we can borrow a lot of the code from Joomla. We don't actually have to do a lot of coding because Joomla does it for us, and we just tell it, this is how we want Joomla to do it for us. So it's not as difficult as it might sound. Then version 4, we'll move to front-end navigation parameters, and then, so that's basically just viewing the recipes in the front end, and then we'll get on to front-end management of the recipes and creating specialized attributes for recipes. So you can see then how you can extend the recipes data object. So, on to the cooking. You're supposed to get a little chuckle, that picture. Never mind. Oh, thank you. Right, okay, so what we need to do now is install version 1 of the component. So let's get it up. This. Oh, wrong one. Okay, so we've got a little message to say the component was installed successfully and it's called Recipes Manager. And now, if we go here, we can see the Recipes Manager, Recipes Overview, and the categories. As I said, all it does is output Hello World in the front end. And I've already created a menu item in my top menu. So if I go to the front end, here we've got recipes. I click on that. And hello front-end world. So that's all we've done so far is a component that just outputs text in the front end and the back end. So let me show you how we've gone about doing that. So the file structure, I'll go through this in NetBeans in just a second. If you've ever looked at the back end of a component in Joomla, this file structure should look familiar. You've got assets, which is basically where CSS, images, JavaScript are held for the front and the back end. Controllers, helpers, language, models, SQL, they're all folders that are there that might not mean very much. Hopefully by the end of the session, they might mean a little bit more. And as I said, it basically outputs Hello World in the front end and the back end. So before we dive into the code, I need to give you a little bit of background because there's one thing that Joomla components developed using the Joomla framework or platform use, and that's something that's called the Joomla MVC. It's not a multiple vehicle collision. MVC stands for Model View Controller. So in essence, there are 3 parts to this. It basically breaks down the process of creating a component or any bit of code into 3 bits. The controller handles the interaction between the user, the browser, and the application. The model handles the data objects, the interaction with the database. And the view handles the presentation of the output and what the user actually sees. So basically these 3 sort of form a triangle, the model, view, and the controller. So if you've actually installed the application, you'll see these are the core files. A lot of those folders that have been created are there, but they're empty. They might just have an index.html file in. The files that actually matter are the ones that we've got here, and I'm going to talk about the ones that I've marked with a star. So we'll start off with the recipes.php. So this is the back end, and remember, if you remember what it looked like, in the back end we had just something that outputs Hello World. So what does the code look like? Administrator, components, scroll down. So those are the files that we saw earlier on, and recipes.php. Since the screen's quite small, I'll make this a bit. So can everybody see that? Do you want me to make the font a bit bigger? Is that okay? In the back? So this file is really not doing very much. It's basically just when you call a Joomla component, this is the first file that will get called. It's basically got a security check, so it's always good practice in all your PHP files to put something like this in. It basically won't allow the script to be run unless it's been called from something inside Joomla already. So that's the security check. There's another security check in the back end that basically says, is this user authorized to manage the component com recipes? So, there's no point me trying to explain all of that function and exactly what all the different bits do, but you can see basically JFactory is getting the user. We're calling an authorization function, and it's authorizing us to manage the application core components, core recipes, I mean. And if that isn't allowed, then it raises a warning that you're not allowed to do that. Then it's basically calling what's called a controller inside of the back end. And that is a file here, controller.php. And this file actually is doing nothing at all. It's basically just adding a submenu and then displaying the page. So the combination of the recipes and the controller file, that's really the controller. In a sense, the recipes PHP file is part of the controller as well as the controller.php file. So where have we got to here? We've got the recipes and controller.php file. Then we have a helper script. So what does that one do? And that is here. So you see here in the recipes controller file, we're calling add submenu, and that is being called from this file here. Add submenu. And this is again using Joomla code. So again, if you use basically, when I first started coding components, I didn't understand what all these functions did. I still don't understand what a lot of them do. But when you see examples of them, you learn, oh, that's what this function does. If you don't know what a function does, try commenting out and see what's gone on the page, or put two of them in. But I think it's fairly clear that J submenu helper add entry is going to add a submenu entry to your submenu. So, we can learn things from there. Yeah.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yeah, far away.
You go ahead and finish your piece about what you were describing there, then I have a question about helpers in general.
Right, okay. JText. Now, are people familiar with this function, JText, : underscore? Yeah, not everybody. Basically, what we've done with this application is from the very beginning, we wanted to make sure that it's localizable. So in other words, we don't want to start off building an application that's just English that we're not going to be able to translate. So what we do is we create language strings like com_recipes, and then we have a language file, which I haven't got here, it's actually in a different folder, but basically we'll translate that for us so that when we see that in the page, recipes overview, recipes categories, that text comes from the language file. And I can show you where that is. That is actually in the administrator. Oops. Languages here. Can be down here somewhere. There we go. com_recipes.ini. And the structure of these files is very simple. You have a key at the beginning, which the form in Joomla 2.5 is that it's all capitalized with no spaces. It's underscores to separate out the words. So we have com_recipes, and then we give it a value, recipes manager. So if you ever wanted to translate this into Spanish or French or Japanese or whatever, you basically have the appropriate language file, and your component is then available in that language as well. So, yes, you had a question?
Yeah, so I understand the separation between models, views, and controllers. What
Yeah.
I guess I don't understand as well is the notion of helpers
Right.
is going into almost like is it something that doesn't neatly fit in within
Yeah, you could.
models?
Yes, you could say that. The helpers, as you'll see a bit later on, some of the helpers are. Let me see if I can find you an example here. There are two sorts of helpers, and where are we?
In general, or with this component, there's two kinds of helpers?
Within Joomla, within this component. Again, if anybody knows better, I'm not an expert on all of this stuff, But this one, the common recipes helper here, we called that from our controller, didn't we? Here. We declared a specific function call ourselves to the add submenu call. There are other functions that we put into helpers and helper classes that Joomla tests, are these helpers there? If they are there, then it will use them. So specifically things like, to give you an example, if you have the categories manager, I'll show you the categories manager in specific detail, but there's the way to call back and get back to your component from the categories manager is controlled by a helper. And Joomla says, if this particular helper is there, then I'll use that to get back to the component.
So let me ask a question kind of in a different way. I mean, what if the controller is interacting with the browser,
yeah.
the model's kind of interacting with the database, then if this helper file doesn't belong in the controller, then in my limited way, simple way of thinking, I think, okay, that must be part of the model. But it's not in the model.
No.
Why? I guess maybe that's.
Well, the thing is, everything doesn't fit into. It's not everything fits into the model view controller. But basically, help. And I guess a helper could help out as a function in the model or in the controller or in the view. You'll see later on. There's what's called a factory class, and basically what all of these things are: the model view controller, factories, singleton classes. They're all what's called a design pattern. And basically, people have developed a particular way of doing something that you need to do lots of different times, and they've tried to find the most optimal way of doing it. And things like a factory has been defined as a design pattern, and that's then reused over and over. So, in Joomla, when we get access to the database object, rather than having a global variable which is floating around that anything can use, we have a factory method that basically goes off to get us the database object when we need it. There are utility classes, again, and a lot of this stuff again is changing into Joomla 3.0, and it has changed into 2.5 because design patterns and thinking changes. Okay. So where we got to? So we've touched a bit on the helper script, which loads the submenu in the back end. Now, there's a few little files. If you just create them and put them in the right place, Joomla, again, a bit like the helpers I was talking about a moment ago, if you create a file called access.xml and put it in the back end, you'll get lots of magic behavior as a result. So I'll show you what the access file looks like. So this is the access file, and what we've done is created a set of permission. So access and permissions is two different words for the same thing. So we have here core admin, core manage, core create, core delete, edit state, edit own, and we give them labels and so forth. What this file does, and if I show you in the application, you'll see it in action. When we click the options, we get, just by putting access.xml file into the folder, Joomla takes care of everything and basically gives us the permissions tab when we edit the parameters. So if you want to get ACL, if you want to control who can do what in your component, you now get that for free just by putting the access.xml file in. You don't have to code that yourself. Does that make sense? So here we have configure access. This is the core. This is the core manage, create, delete, edit state, and edit own. And again, these little bits of text come from the language files. And let's go back here. Then config.xml is where we've reached next. So this is the other bit that ties it in with the parameters. We basically said in our configuration we want a tab which is going to be have an internal identifier of permissions, and it's going to have a label of config. Make it a bit wider. Config underscore permissions label. So that's a standard Joomla language string which Joomla has translated into configuration. So if you just using the access.xml and this config.file, it'll use the standard Joomla translation for that. So you don't need to do your own translation for some things even, because you can just use the Joomla translations as well. So does that make sense about the rules and the permissions there? The other neat thing, if I go back to it, let's cancel this. Categories here. Note, can you see that at the bottom of the page here, when I hover over it, you'll see the URL is actually going to com categories, extension com recipes. And you can see it up here, option equals com categories, extension com recipes. So we've actually, for managing the categories, Joomla is doing the management of categories. We don't have to write anything to manage categories. We just tell Joomla how to interact with com categories, and we don't have to recreate that wheel either. And if we go into, if I was to create a new category here, and I go down, here you've got permissions. Those permissions have also come from the access.xml file. So if you want to create specialized permissions for your categories, you just put them into your access.xml file, and Joomla will pick them up and you can use them without having to code anything. You just by putting that XML file in that right folder. So config.xml we've covered. Right, so let's now move on to the view. The view is handled by two files in this case. So it's in the views folder, recipes, and the files are view.html.php. And something I should have mentioned earlier on, all these files have particular naming conventions. So it should be fairly obvious if you look at the specific example. So the view here is recipes, because the layout is recipes and the view is recipes in this case. So we have both of them the same. But if you're creating different sorts of views, different situations, you'll see the naming conventions have to follow. When we get to specific individual recipes, this might make more sense. But also things like the controller you saw, we were using the word recipes in the name of the controller as well. So you have to keep the names consistent. So what have we got in here? We've got a display function, which is doing just two things. It's loading a style sheet, recipes.css. It's adding a toolbar, and it's calling the parent display, which basically does the displaying of the page. It doesn't do very much then. The toolbar does a few more interesting things. So here we've got the J factory I mentioned earlier on. So we're logged in as a user, and our application wants to know which user is logged in. We just call jfactory.getUser, and now we know the result of that is user here, and this user is now the person who is actually logged in, and we can get information about this user. We also use the toolbar helper to set the title of the page. So we've done that there, and here we are authorizing. Is this person authorized to administer com recipes? So am I logged in as somebody who can change the configuration? If I am, then I will add in the preferences, which is the parameters options button. Okay? So if I was just logged in as a manager, I might not have permission to parameterize or customize this component, and in which case it would skip this section and I wouldn't have the options button in the back end. And then we add a help. So again, we put a language thing for the help and we put in a URL. So I'll just show you how that works. Let's cancel this. So we're back into the recipes manager here. This is the options button I showed you just then. So again, if you're logged in as a manager, you might not have permission to see that. The help is just a page you might put on your website. So you'd put that on your page, on your site, and in this case I've got no content, so that doesn't, it appears on the screen on the left here. You don't see that, I'm afraid. Right, then, where had we got to? Oh yes, we've done the view.html.php, so let's go back to, so that's not doing very much. That's basically the first level of the view. The default file that's displayed in the view is called default.php, and that file is just outputting hello world. So what we've seen is the controller, if I go down to here, is calling parent display, and that's then calling a series of Joomla function calls which pass on the control to the view, to this display method up here, which adds the toolbar, again calls the parent display method of the view, which in turn ends up calling this file here, the default.php file. So we've got our hello world output there. Wrong one. And so recipes.xml, it's worth mentioning that one. Let's get my mouse. So, excuse me, this is the installation file. I'm afraid it's a Joomla 1.7 version, but it hasn't changed really for Joomla 2.5. You've got information about who has written this, and the copyright, the license, and so forth. You see here the description is com recipes XML description, and the name is com recipes. Again, if you follow that naming pattern and put the language strings in your language files, then when you install it, you'll get the description, which is this one here, and you'll get the name in the list of components you've installed will be translated. It won't show it as com recipes, it'll show it as whatever the translation is of com recipes. We have a couple of install scripts, which are loading SQL. If I show you that now here, it's not doing a lot. Select one. It's not creating, all it is a placeholder at this point. And then you install the files. And this is, have people looked at component or module or plugin installers and the XML files to control that ever? But basically, we list here all the files that we want to install. Files in the root directory we have to name individually. Beyond that, if you have folders, you can install all the files in a folder just by giving the name of the folder. You don't have to name individual files within a folder. And we have the site language files there. We have the administrator. We've got the files down here, and this is an interesting section here. The menu. We give it an image, which is the Chef 16 image, and that's now, if I go back to the browser, here we've got, do you see this little icon, which looks like, if you looked at it closely, you'd see it's actually an octopus with a chef's hat on. That's our little mini icon for that, and that is set, oops. That is set by this image attribute. The name of the menu item is com recipes, but as you saw, it's translated in the menu as recipes manager. It doesn't come in as com recipes. So again, if you follow this pattern, naming the components with the right text in the right place and the language files, then Joomla will take care of all the translation for you. So you get a well-behaved component. And we create two sub-menu items here. There's a few little tips which are worth remembering. You need to escape ampersands and so forth. Again, this stuff, if you use this as a skeleton for your component, just look through it. If things don't work, refer back to this. And if this one was working, then you've got something to go on. And again, the language files. The language files are going to be in a folder. And if you actually unzip the installer packages, you'll see where those language files actually are and how they relate to the underlying folder. So that's the back end. The front end is not doing a lot. It's very similar to the back end. We've got the recipes.php. It's pretty much the same as we had in the back end. Let's go show you that. So this is my development setup, so I end up with a lot of things installed. Right, here we go. So again, exactly the same as the backend, but in this case, we don't want to have the extra security check. Is this person authorized to access this component in the backend? We, strictly speaking, probably don't need that because Joomla has allowed them into the backend in the first place, but it's worth having that security check in there. What was the next file? Yeah, the controller is the same. Exactly the same as a backend. But in this case, we're not currently loading any CSS, so we don't need to worry about that. And then in terms of the view files, exactly the same pattern as we had in the backend. So you see that there's a familiar pattern coming out. But once you've done 2 components, I think, probably by the time you've done 2, you'll start getting the hang of, how you name these folders and so forth. What would be really neat would be some sort of scaffold or bootstrapping tool that, because you're having to do a lot of the same coding. You're having to name all your folders, you're having to name your components, you're having to basically recreate the same sort of thing over and over again, all of which has to be typed in, which is a bit of a hassle. So you can use global search and replace, but it would be better, I think, to have a little, somebody, I think, developed one for Joomla 1.5, which is a system to bootstrap a component from scratch. I think it would be useful to have for Joomla 2.5 as well. So again, recipes, view recipes, display, doesn't do anything. This is actually, that file is pretty much redundant because it's doing nothing at all. And the view, default.php, hello front world. So that's where we are. So that's basically, actually, there's one other file I should mention, which is, yeah.
The asterisks are those required files?
No, the asterisks are to remind me to talk about them in more detail.
Okay.
Well, no, they're also the ones that when you're doing this, they're the ones you should look at more closely, because the other files are either empty or are doing nothing very much at this stage in the component.
So the second question is, I really like that scaffolding idea.
Yes.
I'm watching a little late, but I saw your progression of version 0.1 and
Yep.
on down. I mean, would it, if I wanted to build a scaffolding application,
Yes.
would starting with the barest minimum sets of files that are always going to be needed for
Yep.
the component, would version 0.0.1 be a good one to?
No, probably version 5, but without some of the things that are specific to this component. Yeah, so you'd basically strip out some of those things. And this component has just recipes and recipe, so a single recipe and multiple recipes. But if you're building another component, you might have 4 or 5 different data type of objects or different views. So your scaffold tool would want to be able to define multiple ones together. Yeah. So one other file I should just mention, or 2 other files actually, the metadata.xml. That's basically used to control various aspects of the view, so controlling menu items, what parameters and things you can set in the for front-end display and so forth. And the router.php file, again, that interacts with something that Joomla does all the time. So just by putting in a router.php file, we can define how our Ceph URLs are defined in Joomla. So now I think we should go on to something that, oops, wrong button. Go on to, it says the elapsed time is no seconds. Don't know what's happened there. Something a little bit more interesting. We're going to uninstall version 001 and install version 002. And at this point, what we're going to do is set a few permissions, or look at setting permissions, create some categories, and the foundations for the back-end management of those. So, you probably never would install a version 0.0.1 because it actually, if you looked at it in all the detail, it hasn't actually initialized everything quite right, which is why I'm uninstalling it at this point and installing version 2. You'd probably start with version 2. If I uninstall it. And you'll see, I'll show you in a second what is different. Okay, so what's changed? Where are we? Okay, so first place to start is the SQL queries, or the SQL files in our installer. So actually, just to save a bit of time rather than going, I've got the different versions here. So the backend, SQL, install. So now, rather than just having select one, we're creating a database table. So this is all just standard SQL, create table if it not exists. So are people familiar with using a hash underscore underscore? So in Joomla, whenever you're using a database table, always name it in your code hash underscore underscore, and Joomla will replace that with the prefix for your database. So that way, there's no risk of you writing code that only runs on your server and not on anybody else's. We've basically got here, the standard sort of stuff: IDs, category IDs, title, alias, description, hit, state, checked out, ordering. So this is a good tip here. Almost all of these fields have important names that Joomla uses. So most of the time, you're going to want to have almost all of these fields in your tables. You might not have a description, but basically, title, alias, category ID, they allow Joomla to do things for you without you having to code them yourself. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. Put a few indexes on them so that we can find them, by access level, state, and so forth. And probably shouldn't be using engine my anymore, but I'm old-fashioned.
What should you be using now?
Well, the Joomla, Joe, do you know NODB? When's that coming in?
Well, what I try to do is I just leave the engine off.
Yeah, leave the engine off, and then the default.
Yeah, because I've run into situations where I end up with
A mixture.
extensions where both engines are used.
Yeah.
And it just gets to be a huge
Yeah,
deal with.
yeah. So probably what you do is, oops, take that out. And then we have an uninstall. Well, personally, I tend not to put an uninstall database bit in because people accidentally hit uninstall and then they complain, where's all our data gone? They think if they're doing an upgrade, uninstall and install. It's one of those things, if you want to allow people to uninstall and clear out the data, I think personally you should have a little button or command with lots of warnings before you click it, uninstall the data, and then uninstall the component.
So you have one file there that the file needs to exist, but if it's empty, then...
It doesn't do anything here. It doesn't need to exist. If I didn't define it in my XML file, it wouldn't refer to it, but I'm putting it there so you know. But basically, if you wanted a database to clean out the database when it's uninstalled, you'd put the drop table statement there. There's something more interesting here that we need to talk about. The second file is SQL updates 002. And the file, this version, is, if I show you in the recipes.xml file, this is version 002. If you create this folder, updates, and we put in a file, updates 002, what that means is when you use the Joomla upgrader, it basically knows we're upgrading into version 002, and it will call this script. So if you ever add an extra field into your database, if you follow these naming conventions for your update files, then, let's say you get to version 4, and version 4 you want to add an image, say, then you can here just put in a statement, add an extra column into the database, and at that point Joomla will do it for you. Does that make sense? Right. Languages, localization files, we've just, if you keep looking at those files, you'll see each time we go through an iteration, there's more and more language files lines I've been adding to that file.
Maybe you should mention that you have to add an extra update line in your metadata file, in the installer.
Oh, in the installer, yes.
Otherwise it doesn't work.
Yes, yeah, I'll show you.
The folder doesn't have.
It has to be referred to, yes, that's true. Let me show you that here. Here, update. You need this block, that's the critical thing. If you have that block and you've got the files following that naming convention inside the folder you refer to here, that's what looks after the upgrades. I didn't actually develop all of this myself. Some of this I just borrowed from other already written Joomla bits. You'll see actually mentions to Andrew Eddy's name in a few places, I think even. So, what's next? The main view script I was going to look at next, how that has changed. So, actually I'll just show you what we've got. I don't know if anybody was awake when I clicked on this, but you see here we've actually got a few dishes already set up. That's one I prepared earlier on. So because I didn't delete the database, my recipes already exist. If you install it, you won't be able to see that at this point because we haven't got a mechanism for creating them. But we want to be able to get those items, and that's what we're going to be able to do here. So there's a few special commands that we're following here, and if you follow them in this sequence, you'll get meaningful data. So get state, let me show you in the browser to understand what the state is. You see here we've got a filter for text, so we can search for beef. Sorry to the Hindus in the room. Status, categories, access, language, and so forth. You know, if we basically go from page view to page view, a lot of these settings are remembered. They're stored in the state of the user who's visited the page. And that's what this get state call is doing. Get items is going to go off and get the items that we're actually going to be displaying. And the pagination gets the pagination. If we had a long list, more than 10 or 20 of these things, you'd see the pagination at the bottom.
33. It's getting the select status.
The state. It's the state variables of things like what keyword search have we currently got? What are we looking for things that are published on? Sorry?
It's a collection of variables.
Yes, it's a collection. I'll show you what that, because this is calling a Joomla function. Joomla then does lots of things and calls a function back from our component, and I'll show you that in just a second. So that will make a bit more sense then. These things all record errors if there are any errors, and if we get errors, we can output them and basically handle it that way. You know, it's probably not a very graceful way of dying, giving you a 500 error page, but you know, Joomla, I don't know, Joomla 3.0, is there going to be better exception handling? Joe, is there going to be good exception handling in Joomla 3.0? Or are we 4.0 for that?
I think we're trying to move everything to the native PHP exception.
Yeah. So
And then just work on it from there.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure what the API is going to look like.
No. But you know, a good application would allow you to intercept different sorts of exceptions and handle them in different ways and give more meaningful messages. At the moment, we just have an error. You know, it's not particularly helpful. If it was a database has gone away error, that's different to you're not authorized to do this sort of error. Yeah, we still had before the style sheets and the toolbar. So what do these three lines do and how are they working? They come from the model file because, where are we here? We've now got this file in models called recipes.php. Again, following the naming convention. You know, you'll see other examples where the names, because it's not very helpful to say recipes. You know, it might have been better to have a different name, but the constructor is giving us the configuration fields, and some of this stuff, again, you don't need to worry about. If you just recreate this code for your fields, it'll just behave itself. You know, you don't have to understand everything that it's doing all the time. Populate state. So remember we had the get state call. That's what calls this ultimately. And this is using a combination of two things. So when you log in, Joomla stores a cookie, and it stores information about your session. So you're logged in, you've been doing various things, you've got permission to do various things, and that information is stored in your session, which is stored in a database table in Joomla. When you call this get user state from request, it does two things. This is a useful function you'll use a lot in the back end of your components. You can use it also in plugins and so forth as well. It's saying, is there something in the request statement? So when you do a get or a post from a form, have we sent a request? Are we basically saying, do we want to filter search? So the text field, the keyword field, was called filter search. So we're saying, have we got a form that submitted something from the filter search? If that is no, it then goes off and says, have we got something in the session to say we're still remembering this from the last time we looked at this page? And if there is something there, then it'll output that into the search. So it's basically, is there a new one from the form? If there's not, then pick it from the session. So the benefit of that is, you know, if you're editing an item, and you had to find it by doing lots of careful searching by keyword, access, status, and so forth, then you've edited it and you hit save or cancel. When you come back up to that top page, generally you want the same list you had of items before you went into the edit. And this state is how that's remembered. Parameters, we're getting the parameters from the components, storing them again in a state that we're going to use. And no, I'm not sure what we're doing there, I'm afraid. Why is it calling the state on? Oh, yes, that's basically the ordering. We're basically setting the ordering as being the title by default. And get list query. So when we call get items, that does lots of different things, goes away. One of the things it does is in the model, it calls get list query. So if you imagine, if you're getting a list of items, one of the things you do is you have a database query that gets that list of items. And we only have to define that. We don't have to define everything else. Joomla does that for us. So it saves us a lot of having to, there's still a lot of coding you've got to do, but you haven't got to write all the code around it. It manages the lists for you. So what's it doing? It's getting the database object, putting it in a variable called database. It's getting a query, so we define the query here. And this is something that's new in Joomla, I can't remember, was it 1.7 or 1.6 when the structured queries came in? But, yes. So basically, rather than, in Joomla 1.5, Joomla 1.0, if you've ever coded in those, you would type in the whole query, select star from blah, blah, blah. You'd put it all. What you can now do is have a structured query, and you call various methods like select, from, select, join, where, authorize, and so forth. Not authorize, where was that last one? Where, and then order at the end. So what we're doing is, if you imagine, are people familiar with database queries? You basically have a select, what you're going to select, from which table you're selecting, which tables you're joining, what conditions are there on the search from the database, how do you want the items ordered, and so forth. And basically, that's what this is doing. It's broken it down into those constituent bits, which makes it easier to understand, but also means that we've got a chance of this application running on a database other than just MySQL. This one's a slightly weird one. This is fairly advanced. Get state. Why have we got a get state inside the select? Well, we can remember which columns we want to display. So if you actually later on in this component make it more advanced and basically say we only want to display 4 or 5 of these columns, not all of them, or we want to select them in a particular order, then you would have a variable inside the search that would just output that. And that's what this is basically saying, just remembering which columns we wanted to display. So you don't actually have to have that. You can basically have get select a.id, a.title. But we're basically future-proofing this and allowing ourselves to, at a later date, select specific columns. Does that make any sense? So from hash recipes, we are getting also the language, the title in the language. So we've got this thing already pre-built with the Joomla 1.7, 2.5 language system. So we join on the languages table. We join on the user table to find the name of the person who edited it. The title, we want to check the access level. Categories. Then we pick up the state on the filter. Do we want to filter the list based on access? Do we want to filter the list on the state, category ID, and so forth? So, I won't go through it all in detail here, but if you just look at the code and look at the example in the browser, you'll see there's a one-for-one mapping between the fields that we're searching on and what we're seeing in these queries. Then ultimately, we just return the query. And Joomla then takes care of generating the list and handing the data back to us, so we don't need to do that. Pagination, we've done nothing. All we've done is say get pagination. It uses the Joomla default pagination because we're using the proper model, the proper class names and so forth. We get the pagination for free. So we don't have to code any of that stuff. So, wrong browser. We touched on the model. Yeah, the recipes table class, I should mention. In a sense, this is also part of the model. This is basically about the database table. At this point, it doesn't actually do very much. You don't actually have to have all of these methods, but they show you the different methods. So when you're doing things with data in Joomla, and it stores information to the table, it will call this table, and it will bind the data to the object that's going to go into the table. So if you're storing a recipe, you've got all the fields coming in, it calls this method bind before the save, and it attaches them. The reason we've called it here is because we want to do something special with the parameters. If you weren't doing anything special with parameters, you wouldn't need that bind function at all. You'd just use the default Joomla one. Storing, again, we're doing a few things like checking the name of the user, the date on which it was stored, whether it's been updated, and so forth. Again, if you weren't worried about that sort of information, you could just leave it, and it would inherit the default Joomla code. It even does things like checking the alias for you. So I suspect you probably would want all of this functionality. So again, it's there, you can just cut and paste. And the good thing about Joomla, we no longer need to define all the fields. In the olden days, when you used a JTable class, you had to define all the fields in this file. Joomla now does that discovery for you. You don't need to do that. So, we're saving a bit of time from all of this. And the layout, let's go back to that. Oops, wrong one. Where are we? View. Yeah, so this is now the view. So remember before we just had Hello World backend or whatever. This is now doing a bit more output for us. I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but basically these are all the individual fields that we had before. And it's put inside a nice field set. We're getting various things. So actually, this is worth mentioning. By using this method here, grid sort, in Joomla in the back end, you often get, in your list, you can just click on a column, and it searches it, it sorts it. If we define our table headings using the grid sort function that we have here, again, just cut and paste, don't worry about at this stage how it works, but you basically say, I want to be able to sort by this field, give it the title for that column, the name of the field in the database. These are just variables to say what the current level, current direction, and the current ordering field is. And you basically get that ordering functionality just thrown in, created for you by Joomla. You don't have to code it yourself. Okay. Anything else? I think I've covered all of this. Oops, wrong button. Front end, nothing's changed in the front end. SQL, we touched on that before. I showed you about how we've now creating the database table and how we're doing the updates. And the language files, as I said, we keep adding new files to that. Yeah, we're fetching the real data, get state, get items, get pagination, we've touched on. And display the list. Well, it's not empty because I actually had some data there already. So we can now go on to create some recipes, but I still need a drink of water. So if anybody wants to stretch their legs before we go to the next session, or if anyone asks any questions on what we've got done so far, or you dazed?
To see it myself is just
yeah.
try.
There's a lot to take in. Don't expect to understand everything. Yeah.
So, yeah, if you wanted, sort of thinking ahead about maybe how this recipes components go, but if you, let's say you had a user who you wanted to give them the ability to make some edits, adds, without giving them back-end access.
Yes. Yeah.
So, there'll be some front-end updates.
Front-end updates, yeah,
would be in version 5.
which all link back to the access to XML.
Okay. Yeah. And I walked in a little late. Are these files available online?
Online, yes. Give me a CD. I'll take one.
Well, my...
You can get a chance to label.
Can I...
You can keep that, yeah.
Sweet.
What do I get out? Working I'm buying myself a coat.
They're in the fridge.
Sweet. Just got to open my eyes.
How are things with you, Vince? Busy?
Still getting over the trouble. Yeah, busy.
No, that's nice part.
How did you get that?
Through from Manchester. Bristol? Oh, really?
When you under permission showing the categories, what did you do? I understand permissions on the component.
Yeah, I'll show you that just again now. Yes, because actually, just before we, when we started the session, relaxing session, I was asked a question about front-end management. We're going to get on to front-end management, front-end creation. That uses the same access.xml file. It's the one in the back end. We don't need a separate one in the front end. So access.xml file basically controls the permissions for the component and the categories, and it's all controlled front end and back end from the same access.xml file. Okay. So, next thing we're going to do is now we're going to uninstall, we're going to install version 3. We don't need to uninstall version 2 because it will now call the update script. Okay, so we now installed version 3. And we're going to go off and create some categories and so forth. So I'll just show you that in action first, and then the code might make a bit more sense. So let's create a category here. Call it savory dishes. But no parents, nothing clever in terms of published and access. Basically all this stuff we get picked up from Joomla categories. We have parameters here, which we can actually manipulate as well, but we're not going to show that in this component. But you can set permissions. So these permissions here are on a category-specific basis. And those get picked up from the XML file, which I showed you just now. So we've got this one here. Let's save this and close it. And we've now got savory dishes. And what else have we got? Yes, so recipe.php. We made some changes to this now to show you what we've done. So remember in the back end, recipes of version 2. Changed? Work this. Oh, no, I'm looking in the wrong place. We've created a new controller file. So you can all just show me there. Again, following a Joomla naming convention and folder naming convention, we've got two new controllers, recipe and recipes, so that if you want to access the list of recipes, it will use the recipes controller and the recipe controller if you're accessing a single one. So which one are we after? The recipe. If we look at this now, this controller, we've just added two functions. We've not added very much, but we've added allow add and allow edit. If you look at the allow add method, this is doing a few little things. What we're doing is checking the, right, let's go to that. This middle bit of that function here, that function called
is JRequest getInt. So that's Joomla 1.7. You should really now start using Joomla 3. This is going to be gone with Joomla 3.0. There's a slightly different way of getting it. But basically all we're doing is we're getting the category ID and we're saying, are we allowed to add to this category? So if we go to the list of recipes and we were to click new, like this, here, we filter the list based on saved categories. Well, we haven't actually got any saved categories. But because we're filtered by saved categories, when we click new, it's going to by default try to create this recipe inside saved categories. And so when we ask the question, are we allowed to edit, it goes off and it checks what's the current filter for the category. And if that value is not 0 or blank, we call, again, remember this user authorize function? And this time it's call create within the category of that category ID. So again, so this is basically call create recipes.category 1, or call recipes.category 3, whatever the category ID is. So it's calling the category specific permissions. So we can now say this user is authorized to create savory recipes, somebody else is only authorized to create sweet recipes or soup recipes and so forth. So you can basically control on a category specific basis. Does that make sense? And then we can do the same sort of thing with our edits. And in this case, it's core edit. So instead of core create, we have here, we now call core edit. So again, you're likely to want to have this level of control in your code. So if you just cut and paste these files, rename them, put into the naming pattern, you'll end up with the functionality that you want to be able to control access on a category-specific basis. And we now also have a new model. Remember we had the model for recipes. We now have a new one for a single recipe. So the models folder now has 2 files in it. Recipe here as well as recipes. And the recipe function has a whole long series of can delete, can edit states, can get table and so forth, get item. So, for example, can delete. When we're looking at a specific record, we want to know, are we allowed to delete this recipe? And this method is going to be called by Joomla. Just by calling the method, giving the method the name can delete, Joomla, before deleting that record, will call our specific version from the model of can delete method. So if you want to put some fancy rule in, that's, this user can only delete recipes which have got the letter P in them or something strange, then you can put that sort of functionality into this method and Joomla will use it. If you want to just use the normal Joomla code, you don't need to define this method and it'll be done the normal Joomla way for you. We also have, what else is interesting here? Get item. Again, we didn't need to define most of these classes, like these methods in the class like get item, because all we're doing here is calling the parent one. So some of these I've left in, just so you see if you want to do something different to the normal, you know what the functions are for. So you can use. So again, don't worry if you don't understand all of that. Run it through a debugger, try it out, and you'll get the idea when you want to do something specific. If you want to do something, hopefully there will be an example of a function in there that you can modify. Now this is an important thing to mention, recipes.xml forms file. This is now using JForm, and we are defining all the fields for our recipe. Now, what would be really nice is if Joomla could actually create that database table for us from that form, but we're not there yet with that. So we basically have to define the database table in the SQL, and we have to define the fields in the form. But basically, ID is going to be a text field, title is a text field with a size of 40, category ID is a category field. So basically there are a lot of standardized field types in Joomla that you can reuse text, category, editor. You know, so have a guess. Who can guess what the field type would be for the user who created the article? I think that might be called. User, yeah. And the language is not language, it's content language, but you know, the names are fairly obvious, and in fact, if you want to find them, you know, if you're struggling, you want a menu item or something, you can't remember, is it a menu or menu item? If you look in the code, Joomla, library, access level, calendar, checkbox, color, combo, database editor, file, group list, image list, language, and so forth. All these different field types that you can use are all in there. Alright, I'll show you how this then translates back into editing the item in a few minutes. And there we have the view script. So we're now going to create the ability to edit this item. So I'll show you how that translates to the view.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure can.
So you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that it'd be great if Joomla could create a database based on the field that's put in there and data form. I mean, so I understand that. You've already created the database that these fields are mapping to in previous versions, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the SQL file has already created that. Yeah. In reality, you know, you probably would start off with something close to version 5 as your skeleton. You know, but I wanted to explain step by step. Okay, the view file. Okay. It doesn't need to be difficult. You'd have to probably, in the form, put in a flag in the attributes at the top to say creating a table. And then it'd just be a matter of reading the XML file and checking the database table. If the table didn't exist, create it. If it does exist, create a match, create X ones. It's fairly simple.
Read sounds simple. Read does that already.
Pardon?
Read already does that.
Rails does it, yes. Yeah.
What was that?
Rails is in Ruby on Rails. You know, it really isn't a difficult thing. You basically have here form, and you probably have an extra attribute to say table, give it the name of the table, and then another attribute, say auto create equals 1, and then you know when the back end of Joomla sees this thing, the auto create equals 1, and the table attribute.
There's a problem when you have one form and you are putting information into two different tables or two different tables.
Yeah. Yes, that's true, but in which case you probably wouldn't say auto-create at that point. Yeah. No, as you said, Ruby does, I mean, Rails does something like it. But, you know, but digressing, that's not the core of what we're talking about here. Although I was trying to find ways of saving, didn't need to type. I was a bit too lazy. Just got it up to the view. Keep getting this back. So we're now looking at the view for recipe as opposed to recipes because we're looking at editing a single one. And the view.php file here has a display method. In this case, it's getState as we had before. And we're doing two slightly different things. Remember before for the list we had getItems as opposed to getItem. So because we're going to edit or create a single one, we call getItem. And we want a form. And so this goes off and looks for that XML file in the forms folder. And we've got the CSS file there. And the edit file. All these field names now, so you see here this form. So when we call here, this form here, goes off, calls the Joomla JForm classes, that loads the XML file and it creates the form that we're going to then use. That's then available for us here. And we can get the label for the form, so we don't need to put in the label tag, or more importantly, all the inputs, if you've got a calendar, which has got lots of little bits of JavaScript for the date selector and stuff, all you have to do is call this form get input ordering, and the form knows how to handle the ordering field from that XML file. So it's much, much easier to define your form using the JForm method. And so we've got the create device, and now if we go to the browser and create a new, all of this information here, these fields here, how they're presented, the editor and so forth, are all being controlled by the XML file and by this PHP file. Okay. Later on we're going to talk about parameters. Worth just mentioning here, with the templates, a template can call another template. So these files in the TMPL folder are called template files. And we can load another one from within a template. So you can break down a complex page into sub-parts. And there's a naming convention, edit underscore params, so that if we call load template params from the file edit, it will then look for a file called edit underscore params, which is what we have there. And it will output and display the parameters. But we haven't got any parameters yet, so we don't need to worry about that. So, hopefully you're seeing, obviously this is complicated, but hopefully you're seeing that Joomla does try to look after a lot of this stuff for you. There's still quite a lot of repetitive coding you've got to put in, but it does save you a lot of work compared to, people have done this stuff in Joomla 1.0 and 1.5. You'll see this is a lot less work than it was then. Yep, so I think we've done all of that. Yeah, right. So let's save a recipe. Egg souffle. The alias is a special field type that will be automatically filled, but we've only got one category, which is savoury dishes, so we'll pretend it's making a savoury egg souffle. And we'll do this. The description. So, you see so far we've got no images for these recipes, we've got no lists of ingredients, we've got no real functionality. This could be anything. Let's save that. We can say that it's egg souffle. That's the only dish that's found on the savoury dishes. Before we go any further, I'm just going to put a couple of these into the savoury dishes. I'm feeling very divisive recipes. We've got beef and pork. Okay. I do have some vegetables and those. Right, so we now have our recipes set up. And basically, something I didn't mention before, we've got the status field here. We didn't go through the difficulty or the process of defining all the different published, unpublished states. Remember, all we did was define a variable called state in the database table and in the form. Just by using that name, Joomla gives us all of this information about published, unpublished archive. We're picking up these toolbar icons as well. So if we now take the egg souffle and trash it, it's gone. We can filter by trash. This egg souffle, we could empty the trash, or we could change this back to published. So a lot of this functionality, all this filtering and stuff, just by following the naming conventions for the fields, you get all of that functionality thrown in for free. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Right, so what's next? On to, we're getting close now, version 4. We're going to get a bit of front-end functionality. So we're now going to install version 4, and what this is going to give us is some parameters for the components, menu options, and front-end navigation viewing of the recipes. So we're not going to do any editing of the recipes yet, just to be able to view them. So any questions before I go on? So we're looking at the front end from there. Okay, we've got recipes, we've got savoury dishes. Click on savoury dishes. Oh, I've missed the translation. So, yeah, probably because I misspelled it. Recipes with I and C the other way around. And we've got savoury dishes, we've got the individual recipes. So if we go back down to egg souffle, we can click on the egg souffle. And you see the egg souffle there. So we've got a bit of basic navigation, nothing very clever yet. If we have multiple categories, these would all appear in little boxes. It's a very basic presentation at this stage. So how have we done all of that? Front-end files. The back end has barely changed. The front-end files, we've now got a few extra things in. So the recipes.xml file, worth mentioning. Front-end file. So we've got this file here. I'm not sure I've got the right. I think I got the wrong name in this presentation here. This file here should be default.xml, not recipes.xml, in the top line. And here, we go to the menu item. We've got the required settings. So we basically can select categories to display the recipes from. So if you create a savouries menu item, a sweets menu item, a soup menu item, and so forth. We also have the recipe overview options. Options used to show where you want to show the tag call, the description, the category images, the number of recipes in each category, and so forth. And again, you see these are using, remember you see how used global is picked up there. With the back to the front, here, and the options, we've now got the recipes overview here. So this is where we'd set the global parameters, and in the menu item, we can either use those global values or change them. The way we did all of that was by changing two files. One is this one here, the default.xml file in the recipes template folder. And we have the first one here, the request field. And that's where we pick up the category. And it's the type is category, and we've got multiple equals multiple. So that when we go to the menu item, here, we can choose one or more category. Okay, so that's how that's defined. And then we have the parameters. So things like whether we want to show the title, the description, the image, empty categories, the numbers of items within the category. That's all picked up from there. And we also get exactly the same sort of file in the back end in this config.xml file. So remember before we just had the permissions? You probably don't remember, but we just had this permission section at the bottom before. And now what we've done is we've added in all these extra fields here, and they appear in here as a separate tab. So if we want to add more parameters, we can just do that. We need to do it in both places. If you want it to be menu specific, you put it in the front-end menu XML file. If you want it to be a component specific value, you put it in the component XML file in the back end. Yeah, there's an orphan file, so you can ignore that one. There. I won't describe that file because it's not meant to be there. The view HTML, get categories and recipes. Right, we'll show you that briefly. This is the same sort of thing we had in the back end, so hopefully it will look a little bit familiar. Here we've got display. Setting the style sheet, getting the states, getting the parameters. What else are we doing? Yeah, we're getting the items. So this one will use the category model. So we're doing two things here. This is important to understand this. We now have two models that we're using. We want to, in the front end, we want to know what our list of categories are, and we want to know information about the items within the categories as well. So we're getting the items now from the categories model, and we're putting out the categories variable, and then we're getting the items from the items model. If that makes sense. And if I show you the model files, so now we have categories model in the front end, the recipe model and the recipes model. The categories model here is the same sort of thing we had before, get items this time. We're applying filter. If you need to understand it for your specific application, look through the code. Hopefully it will make some sense. Unfortunately, I'm trying to explain all of how these things work. But the key thing is here that we're getting the items from the category model, and here we're getting items from the recipes model. Assigning them by reference into the view, so that then when we go to here, the form, we're getting the page heading. If there's an active category, it's getting information about the category of the recipes. Otherwise, it's getting information about the categories. So, again, once you've installed this, put a few categories in there, put a few recipes in, and you'll see that this file is just deciding whether it's showing a list of categories or showing a list of recipes. And if it's showing categories, it's more the categories file. If it's showing recipes, it's more the default recipes file. And what else have we got? Those, yeah, we do the categories for the categories output, the recipes output, the model. Categories table help files. I'll just explain that. I can't remember what's in that. Yes, so basically, to be able to use the Joomla categories models properly, we just need to define this helper class, because that's going to want to know what database table to use and what the extension is, so that it knows how to interact with the category class and the category data. So it's not, again, you just recreate this stuff and you basically get all the functionality thrown in by Joomla. Controller, router, yeah, we've done with all that. Stop showing you the router. Yeah, the router, it might be worth mentioning this. The router file, there's two methods that we need to define in the router file, or the router, unfortunately from America. To me, a router is something a carpenter uses to put grooves in a piece of wood.
And to me, a router is something you do in the garden.
Right.
You should ask what the Germans think about it.
Yes. basically, this is getting information out of the menu item from the query, and it's, if you follow this through, it looks like a complex bit of code, but basically it's putting, there's this array called segments, and it filters on whether what sort of view you want, and you can use it to basically construct and deconstruct your SEP URL. The key thing is, you build it with one, you pass it with the other, make sure that your two functions go backwards and forwards. You know, that whatever rule you follow for one can be undone with the other. That's the basic rule of thumb. And so that's that. Yeah. Okay. We'll now get on to content creation and editing, and then maybe we'll have a bit of time for some questions at the end. So I'm now going to go and install the next one. So we've recently now on to version 5, so it's still awake. There's not much more to do. This is in the front end, so it's saying changes, so I'm going to do that. I'm logged in currently as a super user. So here we've got the option to create a recipe there, or we can go into a category. Create a recipe within the category, that will then pick up the category we've already got, or we can edit an item, like we look at the egg soup there. We can click pencil item and edit that recipe there. We've got a basic editor, title, description, category here, language, and something I'm going to show you. Basically, we will now have the ability to upload an image to this recipe, so which is obviously something you want with a recipe panel. So, as I said before, that all follows the access.xml file. So I'm logged in as a super user, so I've got the permission to do everything. If you set somebody up, say your registered users can create recipes, but they can't publish them, then they won't see the edit, they'll see the add recipe or create recipe icon, but they won't see the edit recipe icon because they're maybe just allowed to create and not edit. If they're not allowed to publish, then when they save it, it won't appear until it's published. That makes sense? So what do we do to make all that possible? So first of all, adding the image that's a very, very easy thing. So all we've done is we've changed the model forms recipe.xml file, and this is the really clever bit about the forms side. Models forms. Recipe. Yeah, actually, this is the same thing. What we're going to do is we're going to stick the image, because basically we're going to have a dynamic, we don't know all the different parameters we want. We could put them in a separate field in the database table, or we can actually just stick them into the parameters field at the end of your record. One advantage of the parameters field is that you don't need to think ahead and plan ahead all the different field types that you might want. The disadvantage is that you can't as easily or efficiently search on them. So, if you're going to have an important field, such as, let's say, suitable for children or vegetarian, being a Boolean field, a yes/no field, you probably wouldn't put that into a parameter because you can envisage wanting to search on that for future days. And searching on a value inside the parameters field doesn't work well in Joomla because it's part of this long text field. So you're better off having a separate field, in which case it's good enough here. But what I wanted to do is to show you how easy and how quick it was to be able to create an image. So what we've done is we created a field, name is image, the type is media, give it a label and a description, and that's all we needed to do to be able to edit that. So if I show you in the back end, click on it. Now we get the recipes parameters appearing there. So just by adding that little block of XML, we get the ability now to create a recipe image. And we can go through, we can browse for an image. Photos, picture of me. I'll pretend I'm an ex-super. Then. There we go. Picture me, so that's how easy it is to create the editing for the parameters. So there's a real advantage in that. So that's, in a sense, one of the reasons I was saying it'd be nice for the XML to be able to adjust the database tables. Because if it was then just as easy to add the extra field into the database table, you'd get that sort of benefit there. But, you know, there are downsides of doing that as well. What else have we done? We have added the, I'm going to skip that. There's very subtle points. If you want to test yourself, you can figure out what's happening in that file at a later date. Don't worry about it for now. The view for editing a single recipe is worth mentioning about in the front end. So we're now looking in the recipes view. So this is the recipes components and the recipe view. And we've got our item, we're calling display, and we see that in yeah, I'm sorry about that, just ignore what I was just saying. Form. So we're now the same as we did before. We're getting the states, getting the item, getting the form, and we now get a return page. That's actually what that subtle point is all about. It's basically which page do we want to go back to after we've saved the item. It's all now about if you've got the item, bind it. So here, we've got the item here from the database, but it's not in the database form yet. Is that 15 or 5? 15. So we're now wanting to stick it into the form, and that's what this statement does here. But if you haven't got one, if it's a new one, you don't have to stick the data into the form. But you know, that's a really clever thing. Using JForm saves you a lot of work. When you're doing this sort of stuff and doing the 1.0, 1.5, you had your data, you had to stick all the variables in, go through the database fields one at a time. This saves you all that hassle. And then we have the edit page. And again, as we saw in the back end, get label, get input, and the parameters here, low template parameters. There. As long as you've got that code, it's using a ULLI. It's not particularly fancy in terms of layout, but it's just to show you the idea. You just create that XML file, define your field in the params as part of the XML file. As long as you've got that, you don't need to then re-edit it. So if I now just have a list of ingredients there, put those into a lookup list inside my parameters, I don't need to change the edit parameters method. I just need to change that XML file and it finds it. And we've got our ingredients list.
But if you wanted to be able to search by ingredients,
Then that's not a good way to do it, that's true. And you probably would want to search by ingredients, yes, indeed.
and was that, I mean, I know one of the reasons why you gave that example is the simplicity of it.
Yes.
It's more complicated to set up a fields item on the XML file, if you were...
Let's say for, well, how would you go about putting in ingredients? You'd want to be able to search on them. So probably you could do something really, really silly, like saying you can have up to 10 ingredients, and then have 10 separate columns in the database table. It's probably not a very good way to do it. So you'd probably have a separate database table using a join for the ingredients, and then, so you it's then getting more complex because you need a different table class, a different model for the ingredients. And in fact, probably you'd want to be able to define ingredients in the database in the same way. So instead of just having recipes, you then have ingredients. And then you'd want quantities of ingredients, and so
That'd be tied to a specific recipe, right?
Yes, exactly. And then you need a way of selecting.
Ingredient, and then in recipe one, you might have 2, and then another.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is probably a very common scenario when you have data in 2 different tables.
Is it common? I don't think there's many situations where it doesn't happen.
I would say, at least from what we've done, that's an easy, 70% of the applications they need to store relation data. So in JSON, what's the best way to do that?
I've not looked at it recently. I'm pretty certain Raphael, it's Raphael, isn't it? Go with that? Your name Raphael? No, sorry, mental block. JForm can feed into 2 tables, can't it, if you define the names of the variables properly.
I don't think you can store 2 different tables.
No, you have to extract the data in your bind. Use your bind method.
Yeah.
And from the bind method, you extract the variables that are relevant to that table. But there's no reason why the form shouldn't combine the inputs.
Yeah, that is right. The form doesn't look into the table, but into the symbolic name defined in the model class.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. But if you're attaching multiple recipes, you probably would have slightly different. Multiple ingredients. I need to think about how the best way to do that would be. So, yes, so what would you want to do next? Yeah, counting the items in child categories and things, searching in the lists. Yeah, so finally, this is the last slide. Just a couple of other useful tips. The version control, there are different ways of putting the versions inside your code. One thing I always find very helpful is the language files. I always soft link them. So if you install one of these things, one of these components, you'll get a language file inserted into your admin language file folder and into your front-end language file folder. The first thing I do after I've done that is I delete those versions and I take a soft link from my development area into the language folder. Does that make any sense? So, let me show you. The language files, this is my development. We've got here all the files for our components. The administrator and the site side. We've got the language file there is in a folder, language, ENGB, and so forth. If we put those files now in so useful recipes. The language folder is not there. So if we actually check this out as a subversion or we soft linked it from somewhere else, if we have the language file there, the natural thing would be, you add something into the view, you type in the language file, you go to the same place, you change the language file. But that won't show up in your browser because it's picking up the version from the main languages folder or the administrator languages folder. But if you soft link them, if you use a Linux link from one to the other, if you change it in the development environment, it changes it in the main language folder. It's just a subtle point. You will get to the point where you change the language string and it doesn't get reflected, and you think, oh, that's what he's talking about, but don't worry about it until you get to that situation. And what else have we got? Yes, and so the deprecated function calls for Joomla 3.0. If I'd had time, I would have done that before putting this together for you today, but I didn't have time, unfortunately. So there are things like JRequest, there's a few other things in there as well. There's not that many of them which won't work for Joomla 3.0, but they will work for Joomla 2.5 if you use the 3.0 version. So basically, both the new and the old are already there, but the old one's going to go. So it's good form to start using old function, using new function calls already. And then it should make moving this function, this component to Joomla 3.0 much easier. So, any questions? People just shell-shocked.
What was the website to...
Oh yes, yeah, let me show you that. Remind you again. So, it is jevents.net. Oops, jevents.
Do you just want to know that? Just that's all.
So it's on
Just having a
jevents.
very small USB stick.
Oh, thanks, I got a CD.
Okay,
Thank you.
It's on jevents.net under downloads. And then here you've got other downloads, general downloads. Okay. And in there you've got the recipes components. So you've got the 5 different versions in there, and also a copy of the presentation as well. Okay. Anything else?
I got a question. So I got a little bit lost on the discussion you guys were having about what JForm can and can't do if you're trying to join with a different table.
Yep.
So is the answer that maybe more layman's terms is that you can join different tables with JForm?
Yeah,
but you have to do a special way?
Basically you need to name your fields in JForm in such a way that when you get them in your model, so remember I showed you that find function when it's doing nothing at all? Yep. Remember that? Yep. That's basically used during the saving process, during the loading process. So at that point, you would look at the values that come in from JForm, and you'd strip out of those the ones that relate to that specific table. And the other ones, you'd then say, right, I've now got my ingredients. The ingredients would probably be an array or a comma-separated list of IDs. And then you would process that differently. You'd call a separate function inside that method. Okay. Does that make sense?
Not totally, but I think I get the answer that you can do that. And
Yeah.
I need to
But you have to, it doesn't do it for you, you have to intervene.
Thank you. Really good 2 sessions.
That's good. Very good. Yeah.
So, you use recipe and recipes, 2 different controllers and models
Yes.
for this type of
An individual one, yes.
So, is that the best practice? Because I've seen component that not established one or everything.
I think it's best form to have the 2 separate ones. And sometimes I must admit that I use, because sometimes you want to use the same functionality for an individual item as for multiple items. And sometimes I use just the one, or I use one model and then get the split functions, put them in different ones as you need. I was basically trying to keep it as pure and as clean as
It's a
possible.
preferred way, but then, as per your need, you just...
Yeah, personally, if you look at Geraint, I just have one model function because I use one for all the different classes because you end up using the same thing in so many different places. It saves having to code it more than once.
Yeah, but aren't the controllers derived from different base classes or lists?
Yes, yes.
So on the controller side, you don't have a choice, I think. On the model class, you have.
Yes. Yeah. But you can always override what controller Joomla uses. Use your own naming convention.
I mean, you can beg for trouble when you
Yeah. There are frameworks out there, like Nuku, for example. There's it'll handle the singular and not plural, and it even does some of the language handling for you. Basically, it knows that recipes is a plural of recipe, and it will get you a list if you go wrong, and get you like an individual one and all the other things. So there are different ways, different philosophies of tackling this.
Is it listed on Joomla.org what functions are deprecated for?
I think there is an article, isn't there? Yes. There's in the wiki. Chris Spencer, I'm 99% certain there is. There's also in the system debug plugin, there's a parameter which you can enable the logging of deprecated functions. The trouble is, there's two problems with it. One is the core of Joomla is full of deprecated function calls. So if you're trying to find your own, you're hunting for a needle in a haystack. And the other problem is it doesn't actually tell you where it was called from. It just tells you it's been called. So I think it would be handy if it actually said which function actually had this deprecated function call in it. But if you search in the Joomla libraries folder for the word deprecated, look at all the files where it appears. That would be a good place to start.
What would you do if you want your component to be Ajax inherited?
There would be several ways of tackling it. The most simple way of doing it, say you're wanting to get data back, you would define a view and a layout that didn't output any HTML, it just outputs data for super for Ajax or JSON format. It would follow the same view model system, but it would basically just output the JavaScript object or the Ajax structured data, and you call it with TMPL equals components, bit on the URL so you don't get any modules. That'd be one way of doing it.
You do a format equals raw.
Pardon? Yeah, or format equals raw, yes. What I, personally, I also spin my own, you're going to talk about web services tomorrow. I've got a standardized, slimmed down web service call that I use all the time, which is basically doesn't have all the stuff that Joomla loads. So instead of the page taking a third of a second, it takes 0.05 of a second to get the data. But as long as it's not being called too often, you don't need to do that.